material and material instances. So today we're going to create our first material and material instances. And then we're going to use them to create the grid guides that are going to help us design and align our environments. So let's do this. Okay, so in Unreal, the first thing I'm going to do is import a few assets that are going to help us align our grid in the world. So let's do this. I'm going to go in Content and create a new folder, which I'm going to name Art. And open it. In there I'm going to create two new folders. So Meshes and Textures. Okay, I'm going to start with the textures. You can open it, and inside it you can create another folder that I'm going to name Grids. And we can open it, and this is where we're going to import our textures. So I'm going to go in Windows Explorer and select my three textures. So TX hexagon line, TX square line, and TX triangle line. I'm going to get them and drop them in Unreal. And that's it, we have our three textures imported. We can click Save All to save them all and save selected. Perfect. Now let's do the same thing for the meshes. So I'm going to go in the meshes, create a new folder, which I'm going to name Grids, and open it. I'm going to go back in the Windows Explorer, select my three FBXs, so SM Grid Hexagon, SM Grid Square, and SM Grid Triangle, and drop them in Unreal. Here the FBX import options window appears, and we're going to change a few things. The first thing we want to do is to turn off the auto-generate collisions, because there's already collisions in my meshes and I don't want Unreal to generate some. So I'm going to uncheck this. And then I'm going to expand the little arrow right here, and all the way at the bottom I'm going to make sure that the normal import methods is in import normals and the normal generated method is in mikkt space. Okay, perfect. Let's collapse this. And we can continue going down. So in MISC here we have convert scene that is checked, and the other two checkboxes have to be unchecked. Perfect. And then for the materials, we're going to change the second drop-down menu from create new materials to do not create materials, because we don't want Unreal to create materials. And in my case, I don't have any textures in my FBXs, so it doesn't really matter, but I will uncheck import textures just in case. And that's it, then we can click on import all. Here the message log appears with a warning that says there's no smoothing group in those FBXs, but it doesn't really matter because these are just basic geometry, they don't need smoothing groups anyway, so I'm going to close it. And then I can click on Save All to save all the meshes. But now you can see in the thumbnails of our meshes that they don't have any materials. So if I drag them in the scene right now, they only have the default checker pattern given by Unreal. So let's create materials for them. So I'm going to go back in the art folder and create a new folder, which I'm going to name materials. And in there, I'm going to create my first material. And actually, since we only have 3 materials in the whole project, this is actually creating the third of all of our materials we're going to need for this whole project. So that's pretty good. Let's click on material right here, which I'm going to name m_color because it's simply going to be a simple color. Let's open it. And here we are in the material editor. We have a lot of stuff in there, a lot. If you look at the right, you have all the functions you can access in the material editor and that you can plug into your material. But we're not going to use most of them, and we're going to keep it really simple. So for this material, we're simply going to change the color, so the base color of our sphere right here. And to do that, we're going to need a color node, which is named vector3 in the material editor. So let's right click and search for vector3. Constant 3 vector. Click on this. Here we go, we have our color. And since it's a vector3, we have 3 floats, which are the R, G, B of the color. And you can change it on the left right here. And you can change the color with the color picker. Let's do something like that if you want to. So now to apply the color onto the sphere, we simply have to plug it into base color. And that's it. We now have our basic material that can change the color of our objects. And then there's a few other things that we can change in the material that will affect the render a lot without making it too complex. And these parameters are metallic, specular, and roughness, which can all be modified with floats between 0 and 1. So let's do that. To create a float, you can right click and search for constant. This is the float in material. But you can also use shortcuts to create the material nodes, and it's way faster. So let's delete that one. So to create floats, you can simply hold the 1 key on your keyboard and click, which creates floats for us. For vector 2, it's simple. You hold the 2 key on your keyboard and click. For vector 3, it's also the same. You can hold the 3 and click, which creates a bunch of nodes for us. So then if you need a few colors, a few parameters, or a few vector 2s, you don't have to go search in the menu. You can simply click and they will appear, like so. Okay, let's delete all that. So in this case, I'm going to need 3 floats for the metallic, specular, and roughness. So I can click, click, and click, and I can connect them. And then you can change them if you want to affect the result right there. So let's say if I select the float connected to the metallic and make it a 1, here you'll see that the sphere changed a lot and it's now completely metallic and reflective. And you can do the same for the other two. But for now, I'm simply going to set them all to 0. So 0, 0, and 0. And that's it. That's all we needed to do to create this material. So let's save it. And we can now go assign this material to our object. So let's go back in 3. And here I have my material in the top left corner, so I can take it and simply drag it on top of my objects, like that. Here we go. We now have our 3 objects that have the material on them. And if you select them on the right in the detail panel, you can see the material right here. So it's assigned to the element 0 of our materials. Perfect. But something isn't right. You remember I said that I only used 3 materials for the whole project. And if you remember the trailer, you probably saw a ton of colors and a ton of materials. So how did I do that? Well, it's time to talk about material instances. So what's a material instance? Well, it's a way to create variant of our main material right here. That way we can use the same material logic, but we can change some parameters and make it look completely different. So let's create them, and then I'm going to explain you why it's important to always use material instances when possible. So let's do this. To create a material instance, I'm going to right-click on the material I want to use, so mColor in my case, and at the top of the menu, I'm going to click on Create Material Instance, like so, which I'm going to name MI, because it's a material instance, and then underscore the name of the material. In this case, I want to create 3 colors, because these material instances are child of the mColor. So I'm going to create 3 colors. The first one's going to be red, so mi underscore red underscore 01, because we're going to have multiple shades of red. And then I'm going to create 2 other ones. Right click on the material, click on create material instance, mi underscore green underscore 01. And the last one, right click, create material instance, mi underscore blue underscore 01. And we can save all. Then I'm going to open all 3, so open these 3 material instances. And we can already see that it's super different from the material editor. And this is because we can only affect a few settings, so Unreal only shows us what we can change. So if we take a look in the details panel right here, you can see the parent material, which is the material that was used to create this instance. And then if we expand those categories right here, we have access to a few settings that we can change, which would affect the final result of the material. But in our case, we don't really care about those settings. And the settings we want to change is the color, the specular, roughness, and metallic. So let's do that. I'm going to collapse these 2. And then we need a way to expose our variable in here. So let's do this. I'm going to go back in the mColor, which you can do by clicking on the tab like I did, or you can also double click on the mColor right there in the parent slot. And here we have our 4 settings that we want to make available in the material instance. And it's pretty easy to do. The only thing you have to do is right click on one of those parameters and click Convert to Parameter. Like so. By doing that, Unreal creates a node for us that is a parameter, which is both editable in the material instance window and also in code. So we'll actually be able to change this color in the game if we want to. But first we have to name it, like any other variable. So let's name it. Color. Perfect. And let's do the same for all the other ones. So right click on the node, convert to parameter, which I'm going to name metallic. And same thing, right click, convert, specular. And finally, right click, convert roughness. Perfect. So we now have our 4 variables that are named and we can access outside of the material editor. Let's save it. And then we can go back in the material instances. And now if we look on the right, we have all of our variables. Perfect, let's change them. So in my case, I just want to affect the color. So I'm going to check the color checkbox right here. And then I'm going to change the color. So this one is blue. So I'm going to select a shade of blue. And then I can save the instance. Then I can go in the green, check the color checkbox, and change the variable for a green. Then save the instance. And finally, I can go in the red, check the color checkbox, and select a tint of red. Let's say that one. Perfect. Save again. Now if we go back in tree, we now have our three materials right here that we can assign to the meshes in the level, like so. But why should you always use material instances when possible? Well, there's two main reasons, and one of them is pretty obvious. And it is that it's simpler to make some changes to your materials. For example, if I go back in mColor, and right here I'm going to drag from the color and search for a multiply node, which I'm going to connect to emissive color. And in a multiply, I'm going to set a value of 100, for example. And then I can click apply and go back in the level. And we can see right away that all our objects are now emissive. So it was pretty easy to make one change in one material that affect everything, compared to, let's say, if you had multiple copies of the same material instead of instances. Then you would have to go in all those copies and make that changes. But in our case, it's pretty simple. So I'm going to go back in color, delete the multiply, click save. And now our objects are back to normal. Perfect. So that was the first reason. The second reason is that it's way better for the performances, like way better. And this is because when you're asking Unreal to draw a new object, Unreal needs to know how to draw it and what are the instructions to draw that specific object. And these instructions come from the material. So let's say if I go back in the material right here, and here at the bottom I can see that the base pass has 118 instruction, the vertex shader has 40, and 192 for the light map. And those instructions are coming from all the nodes that you put in your material. If you add more nodes, you're gonna have more instructions. And these instructions are what tells Unreal how to draw all the objects that are using this material. So let's say if you have multiple copies of the same material, Unreal doesn't know that it's the same, and is going to recompute everything every time. But if you're using only one material, with a bunch of instances, Unreal knows that the instructions don't change, so it's going to simply change the parameters that are going into those instructions. It's a little bit like a function. The code doesn't change, but the parameters that are going into the functions can change. And as soon as your game starts to be a little bit more complex, you're really going to see the difference in the performances. Which is why you should always use material instances if your objects have a similar look. So these are the two main reasons why you should always use material instances. The first one is that it's going to simplify your life. It's going to make it easier to edit your materials. And the second one is that it's going to be simpler for Unreal to render all your objects. But anyway, there's one last thing I want to do before ending this video, and it is creating a new material. But first, I'm going to create a new folder, which I'm going to name colors. And I'm going to move all my material instances inside it. Move here. And what I will suggest is that every time you do these kind of operation, which I mean moving an asset, deleting an asset, renaming an asset, I will suggest to go here on content and right click, and then click on fix up redirectors in folder. It's either gonna do something or nothing, but I think it's a good idea to do it. But what are the redirectors? Well, it's a kind of shortcuts that Unreal creates when you move or rename an asset. And this shortcut keeps the same name as the asset had before you renamed it. And it links to the new asset name. And this is the technique used by Unreal so that your project doesn't break every time you rename or move something. Because let's say if you check in the details panel here, you still have the link to the MI green material instance. And same thing for all the other meshes, so you have the link to those assets. When you rename these assets, Unreal creates a shortcut for you that links to the new asset. But when you click on Fix Up Redirectors, Unreal goes through the whole project and find all the places where this asset was used, and then replace the reference to the file using the new file that you just created. But anyway, enough talking about redirectors. Let's go back in the materials. Okay, so since the new material we want to create is pretty similar to the previous one, I'm going to duplicate the previous one. So drag it right here and click on copy. Then I'm going to rename it mColor with texture, because we're going to add a texture in there. Let's open it. And here we add what we had in the previous material. Perfect. The first thing I'm gonna do is change the color from the pink I had right here to a white. So it's gonna work better with the texture. And then we're going to create a texture node. So right click, texture sample, which I want to be a parameter like the color and everything else. So I'm going to right click and convert to parameter, which I'm going to name texture. Then on the left at the bottom, I can select the default texture. So click on none and click on TX square line. Perfect. We now have the texture updated in the preview right here. But now we have to connect it to the main material node, so it updates in the material itself and also in the world if we apply this material to something. So let's do that. I'm going to drag from the color right there and search for multiply. So I'm going to multiply the color by the color of my texture. So the RGB of my texture, connect to the multiply and then output in the base color. And here on the sphere on the left, we can see the texture is now visible. And we can also click on the plane right here to have a better visual of what it looks like. Perfect, I'm going to save this material and go back in the level. Here I can select my material and drop it on the main floor. Okay, so now my grid is on the floor. Perfect. But right now the texture is applied in UV space and I want it to be in world space. So if I move this floor right there, like from left to right, the grid will not follow the floor. It will stay in the same place because this is what's gonna happen with our grid when we're going to code it. So that's what I want to reproduce right now. So let's go back in the material to make it in world space, which we can simply do by using a world align texture node, world align texture. This is a pretty big node, but we're not going to use all the pins. The first one we want to use though is the texture object. So I'm going to drag from my texture and connect it to the texture 2D. And it doesn't work, because this texture node here returns an RGB and not a texture object. But that node really wants a texture object. So we're going to create one. Right click and search for texture object. And in this case, I'm directly going to click on texture object parameter because I want it to be a parameter, which I'm going to name texture. And I'm also going to go on the left and change the texture for my texture square. And then I can finally connect it to my world align texture. Perfect. And then we're going to use the XYZ, so the RGB of that node, to replace our previous texture. So connect it to the multiply and then we can delete the texture. Perfect. The last thing we need to make this node work is the world coordinate. So we have to right click, search for world position, and then connect it to world position. Perfect. We can now save and go back in the level. And if we look at the floor, the texture changed. But the most important thing is that if I move the floor, the texture doesn't move with it anymore. It stays on the grid. So now the last thing I want to add to this material is a way to affect the size of the squares. And I'm going to use this cube as example. So let's say I'm going to take this cube and reset the transform so it's centered in the world, and I'm actually going to reset the floor also. And I'm going to drag the cube a little bit above. Okay. So right now the cube is way bigger than all the other squares, so I want to have these squares to be the same size as my cube. So that's what we're gonna do. So go back in the material, and we're going to pass a new parameter to the world align texture. So I'm going to give myself a little bit of space, hold the 3 key on my keyboard, and click to create a new vector. Then I'm going to right click and convert to parameter, which I'm going to name grid size. Then for the default values, I'm going to change the R to 200 and the G to 200. And for the height of my grid, I'd say maybe 100. It's fine. And then we can connect the grid size RGB output to the texture size of the world align texture. Then if we save and go back in the level, the cubes on the floor are now the same size as my green cubes here. Perfect, but they are offset. And we want them to be perfectly aligned with the cube. So let's do that. I'm going to go back in the material. And the position of the grid is based on this node right here, absolute world position. So we're going to offset it. So I'm going to create a new vector tree. Right click on the node, convert to parameter, which I'm going to name offset. As for the default values, I think I'm going to offset it by 50 and 50 in R and G. So in X and Y. And then I'm going to add it to the absolute world position. So drag from the absolute position, search for add, and connect them together. And finally, I can take the output of the add and connect it into the world position. Then if I save and go back in the level, my grid is now aligned with the cube. Perfect, that's exactly what we want. Okay, it's now time to do the same thing for all the other shapes. So I'm going to create 3 new material instances from my color with texture. So right click on color with texture, create new material instances, which I'm going to name mi underscore square underscore line. Then I'm going to do the same thing 2 more times. So right click on the color with texture, new material instance, mi underscore triangle underscore line. And one last time, material instances, mi underscore hexagon underscore line. Perfect. I'm also going to create a new folder which will contain these materials, so colors with texture. And I'm going to drag the materials in there. I can right click on content and click on fix up redirectors. Okay, go back in the color with texture. Okay, it's now time for you to decide which size you want to use for the tiles of your grids. I mean, it's possible to change them later on, but it's going to be more complex once the environment is built. So it's better to start with a good idea of what you want. In my case, I want my tiles to be 200 by 200. So let's do that. I'm going to select my cube and change the scale to 2 by 2 because it's a 100 by 100 by 100 cube. And now that I changed the scale of my cube, I have to adjust the grid. So I'm going to take the mi square line, I'm going to drop it on the grid itself to replace the material by the material instance, and I'm going to open it. I can also do it in real time, so I'm going to drag the window right here and go back in the level so I can see both at the same time. And I can adjust the grid size, so expand the grid size and I can change it to 400 by 400. Here we go, the squares on the grid are now the same size as my cube. Great. I just need to fix the offset a little bit, so I'm going to check the offset and I'm going to scroll here to see, okay, I think 100 by 100 will make sense. Okay, good. So 100, 100. And we're now back with a grid that fits with our cube. Perfect. Let's save this instance. I'm now going to move the cube on the side and go to the next shape. So let's take the hexagon. So I'm going to reset the location to 0, 0, 0. So it's in the middle of the world. I can move it a little bit higher up so it doesn't flicker. But it's important that the x and y coordinates are 0 and 0. Now I'm going to change the scale also to 2 by 2 by 2. And I'm going to take the hexagon line material instance right here and drop it onto the grid. And then I can open it. And the first thing we have to do is to change the texture because it's still using the square texture. So check the texture here in the top left corner and change it to TAX hexagon line, like so. Then we have to change the grid size, so go in grid size and change the R to maybe, I don't know, for 200 hexagon, I think it's 600? 800 maybe in height? 600 makes more sense, maybe 800, I don't know, we'll see. 800, and then for the green, so for the Y it's more like, I don't know, 600 maybe? 800? 800 for the Y, but I think it's more like 600 for the height. Yeah, okay, it makes more sense. So that's more like it. Okay, so it's 600 for the R and 800 for the G. Then we have to adjust the offset, so I'm going to scroll the offset a little bit. So I think it's 0 for the R, and then for the G, 100 will make sense. Okay, we now have the grid aligned to our shape. Perfect. Save and move the hexagon away. Last thing is the triangle, so I'm going to take it, reset the location to the middle of the world, and move it up a little bit. Then I'm going to change the scale to 2 by 2 by 2. Then I'm going to take the MI triangle line and drop it onto the grid. Then open the material instance, change the texture to the triangle line, change the grid size to, let's say, 400 by 400, and then change the offset. So maybe 100 in R and 100 in G. Perfect. We now have all of our 3 material instances that are set up properly for a grid that is gonna be 200 by 200. Let's save all, close the material instances, and even close the material, and save it when we close it. And now that the materials are set up properly, we can scale the floor a little bit bigger if we want to. Whoop, whoop. It doesn't really matter because the texture is in wall space, so we can make it as big as we want. And we can use these grid lines to align our meshes when we build our world. And we can toggle between all 3 to create 3 nice levels. So let's say I can drag my square on the grid, or I can drag my hexagon on the grid, and then I can use these to align all my meshes in my world so they fit with the grid. But we're gonna talk more about level creation in the next video. So for now, I'm simply going to go in source tree and submit all that, and I'm going to see you in the next one. Bye bye!